The Bismarck, with the cruiser Prince Eugen, was spotted by a naval aircraft as having left Norway. There was no carrier available to intercept except HMS Victorious. She was a brand new carrier. She was lying up in the Firth of Forth, and she had a full complement of RAF Hurricanes on board with no wings, but with their pilots, with the object of going out to Gibraltar. However, the balloon went up, as we say, and we were then instructed, when the Home Fleet, including Victorious, went to sea, to land on.
May 41, I was drafted to 825 Squadron, and it was a new squadron. There were only a nucleus of experienced people. Most of the other pilots, observers and tags in the squadron had come straight from training. And so a squadron forming like that does a whole period of working up, doing torpedo attacks and all the other things which are necessary to bring a squadron up to operational standards. We had just begun to do that when the Bismarck escaped, and we were the squadron that was drafted to the Victorious, a new carrier, again working up. So you had, in a sense, the blind leading the blind. The Victorious, a carrier which hadn't reached operational standards, and a squadron of Swordfish being sent on board, which itself had not reached operational standards. And our job was to go and try and do something to the Bismarck.
It was a sight I shall always remember. We'd been out of Scapa Flow giving deck landing training to some of our new RNVR replacements in the squadron. And on our way back, it was a delightful evening. The sun was going down with broken cloud, and coming towards us down the Pentland Firth at full speed were two wonderful sights, the Hood and the Prince of Wales. The Hood I shall always remember. She was wet and glistening grey with water, the waves in her bow breaking on each side, and they went past at high speed, and obviously one knew something was up. When we got into Scapa, the captain and Lieutenant Commander Esmond were called across to the flagship, Jack Tovey, briefing them that the Bismarck was known to be out and was suspected to be coming either through the gap between Iceland and Shetland, but I think at that time Norfolk and Suffolk had picked her up on their radar. Anyway, we steamed out ourselves with the cruisers and destroyers, and as one has read so many times, the chase of the Bismarck had actually begun.
Plans had to be put into operation to intercept the Bismarck when aircraft reported that this Nazi battleship had left Bergen. There were three ways she could reach the Atlantic. The Navy prepared for each of these possibilities by the dispatch of ships and by naval and aircraft patrols. So when the Bismarck was sighted off Iceland, the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet brought in his forces one after another.
She was a terrible menace the moment she got out there. They had a lot of tankers. We found one of the tankers actually later on our way out to Jib. She had supply ships and tankers out the Atlantic. She could have stayed out there for months, just writing off convoy after convoy. There's nothing that convoy escorts could have done, because she could have blown them all. She was faster than any of the escorts. She could have stood outside range of any weapons they had and quietly written off the whole convoy. She'd got to go, because it was absolutely vital we should get her.
And it was all a bit of a rush. Everything was being done in a hell of a rush. And the Victorious was out to sea in pursuit of the Bismarck, whose position at that time was not really known. And if you get a big carrier like that doing something like 28 to 30 knots, it's a noisy job. I remember the steel hangar doors used to rattle because it was an armoured carrier with the aircraft hangars was in fact an armoured box, and these huge steel doors were rattling because the ship was going at such a pace. The weather was not very kind. The TAGs were in a little briefing room, and our knowledge of what we were going to do was negligible. It was only what the ship's company had got. We were not briefed. The tags were not briefed with the pilots and observers.
Bismarck and Prince Eugen were being shadowed by two cruisers, Norfolk and Suffolk. One of them had radar. I think it was Norfolk. The other didn't. But when the Norfolk and Suffolk got too close to the Bismarck, due to the fact that the Bismarck could shell them from a distance of 14 or 15 miles, and of course their armament was nothing like as large, they had to keep their distance in order to shadow and in order to survive. We were the only squadron on board, apart from 3 or 4 Fulmer fighters, the only naval squadron on board. And we were the first squadron to have air-sea radar, which we were trained in, which of course was a great advantage. In any event, the instructions from the Admiralty to the Home Fleet was to attack from maximum range as soon as possible. Our maximum range was about 100 miles.
The captain of the Victorious came up over the tannoy and told us this, and announced that 825 Squadron would take off with torpedoes, attack the Bismarck, and then carry on and get themselves interned in Greenland. This would be at extreme range, you see. So, in preparation for that, we went down to the NAFI and got huge bars of nutty chocolate, filled our water bottles with lime juice, and that was our emergency rations. As it happened, of course, we closed to the extent that we could get back. And then there was another tannoy message to say that we would take off, attack the Bismarck, sink her, return to the ship, go back and attack the Prince Eugen. It seemed optimistic, to say the least.
At that time, the Victorious was brand new, and the homing beacon, which she carried, could not be picked up by our rudimentary gear, which was based on the old Furious. This comes into the story a bit later on. Anyway, we went at full bat across the Atlantic, and as is now well known, we flew off at about 10 o'clock, or just after, on the night of the 24th, 25th. I remember this particularly well because my birthday is the 25th of May.
Late on the day that the hood was sunk, we took off in quite bad weather to attack the Bismarck. I was in the first flight with Lieutenant Commander Esmond leading the flight. My pilot at that time was somebody called Thompson, and my observer was a midshipman called Bill Bailey. We eventually clued up with the shadowing vessels, which was a cruiser, I think, although the Prince of Wales was in that group, and they gave us a bearing for the Bismarck. We had, of course, and had been training with a primitive form of radar called ASV, and so we went above the cloud, and somebody must have got a return on this ASV.
So we took off just before polar midnight on Empire Day 1941. And we flew in formation as a squadron, and we got radar contacts. And we dispersed into subflights in order to carry out the classic attack, only to find out that the vessel below us was not the Bismarck, but was an American Coast Guard vessel, weather vessel, which had been passed by the Bismarck and had been threatened that if they broke radio silence, they'd be blown out of the ocean. So we saw the Bismarck about 8 or 9 miles away. And of course, our surprise attack was absolutely confounded. And so our CO Esmond said, attack individually as best you can.
Which of course was a shambles, because we had radar, and the Mark II and ASV, which had a couple of an aerial each side, and the observer had his box, and he got a blip, and then the pilot had to turn until the size was equal, which meant you were heading at it. Thus you got the direction the target was in. And unfortunately, Norfolk, at the back of my aircraft, had a complete picture of it. He got the Bismarck, he got the shadowing ship, and he got this unfortunate American Coast Guard who was scuttling around at the same time there. But Colin Enever in Esmond's aircraft his set wasn't working very well. And finally Esmond let down on the shadowing ship, recognized it, but we'd lost all our hard-won height by then. But then he sighted the Bismarck and just went boring straight in. Well, there's no point to the rest of the squadron going in with him, because she merely had to turn and comb all the torpedoes. And I pulled off and started to climb, got in the cloud. And that was the interesting point, because all the stuff they were firing at was bursting ahead. And my gunner remembered the other day that I said, you don't have to bother about this bloody stuff. All the lead's falling out by the time we get there. It just smells nasty. And then we discovered after the war that the Germans could not believe any aircraft would ever be flying at less than 100 knots. And they had their fire control system right down as low as it would go, and just weren't doing us any harm.
There was an American Coast Guard vessel which we crossed over. They must have been very frightened. But I remember thinking then that if I was hit, that was the place to go, because we could have been picked up on if anything had happened to the airplane, or to us indeed. She was only about 7 miles from the Bismarck. In fact, it was halfway between the Prince of Wales and the Bismarck, because the Prince of Wales told us that Bismarck was 15 miles on her starboard bow, I think. We lost the essence of surprise, and our attack had to be carried out by Bismarck knowing our whereabouts, and a lot of nasty things were bursting all around the aircraft. And just as we went into the dive, my observer, Dapper Beryl, tapped me on the shoulder, and I thought, oh Lord, someone in the back been hurt or something's happened, because there had just been a nasty great crump. And to my amusement and relief, I must admit, I said, what's the matter, Dapper? And he said, happy birthday, Pat. And I looked at my watch. It was 1 minute past midnight.
The whole squadron came down and delivered their attacks in their own way on the Bismarck, and we went in with Chick as the pilot, and I'm looking forward and can see the Bismarck, and they are throwing everything at us, but fortunately they missed. And we went in, we turned away, and when you turn away, the aircraft lightens, and you go, as you drop the torpedo, the aircraft lightens and you turn away and taking avoiding action. But we didn't drop our torpedo because I could still see it through a little hole in the bottom of the fuselage. And we went out to about 25 miles, and Chick said that he wasn't lined up on his first run in and he was going to have another run in. And I thought to myself, Godfathers, we've been up through all that and now we're going to have to do it all again.
Very patchy. It was a lot of cloud. And you'd see the ship through the cloud, and then the whole lot would go. But actually coming in at last, it was fairly clear. We finally got the attack in. It varied enormously. Suddenly you could see the ship, and then finally, of course, you run into another batch of cloud, or a bit of cloud between you and the ship. You'd lose her again. Unpleasant. I think it was Bill Garthwaite's observer was open. And yes, my gunner made the same comment. It wasn't the stuff that went above or below. It was those little things that popped in between the main planes that he disliked so much. It's absolutely staggering how little the aircraft were hit, in fact, on the whole of that attack. Esmond, I think, got 3 small bullets through. One went just in front of him, one went between him and the observer, the one between the observer and the gunner, right through the cockpit. And then again, I saw Esmond go in his attack, and finally decided the only way, because the moment I dived, they having seen his attack and avoided that, they'd got time to avoid mine. So I nipped down, tried to get in unseen on the water. But they picked us up at the last moment, unfortunately. I was hoping it was bloody rough, as he was already keeping right down low. We might get him without them spotting us and loose the torpedo and get out of it. But they picked us up just before we dropped. Or just after, I think it was. So I think they probably combed those torpedoes, but Pollard's attack came in, and one of his chaps got lost and came in and made a person launch a private attack, and I think that was probably the one that Bismarck didn't see. He'd caught him. Didn't do much damage,
but... We carried on, Dan, and I attacked with my flight commander, Lieutenant, now Admiral Jick, and Garthwaite, who was on the other side. The only other thing I remember was what a beautiful ship the Bismarck looked, although she didn't appear very friendly. And whose one torpedo hit the ship, I've not the slightest idea. And I don't think anybody can claim for themselves the benefit of a hit of this kind. You're always too keen to get the hell out of it. It depended upon your correct angle of approach, that your torpedo had to hit the water so that it wouldn't porpoise. And I seem to remember that we were going in fairly flat in Vic formation, as I said earlier, with Jick just ahead and myself on the port side and Garthwaite on the right. We all dropped. Of course, the Bismarck was zigzagging quite hard, and one just had to aim ahead of her and hope that you get the torpedo and make contact. But the speed we went in about 60, 70 knots, rather slow in facing a ship of that kind. Of course, the crew of the Bismarck, especially their anti-aircraft gunners, were handicapped by the rough seas and also the zigzag the ship was making. But there was a lot of fire which one had to go through. But apart from the approach when the heavier anti-aircraft fire was going off around you, and German flak was always black, and it's unpleasant in an open cockpit like the Swordfish. You can smell it as well as see it. But they were always aiming ahead. They couldn't believe, of course, that we were going so slowly. And we were going slowly because the wind was quite strong. And I think the only person hit was Esmond, who got a bit of shrapnel through his propeller boss. On the way out, Jick, I think, had one underneath, was found in the sea underneath, which took the bottom out of his rear cockpit. And his air gunner, who I think was Bunce, wasn't it? But he had to sort of sit there with a cold draft blowing up his bottom all the way back to Victoria's.
Our subflight, which was led by an RN sub-lieutenant, we managed to attack in formation. That is to say, flight formation with one leader. I was on the port side, the other fellow was on the starboard side. So we came in to attack horizontally, that is to say, three abreast. And I was so intent on marveling what a wonderful sight the Bismarck was. I forgot what she was, something like 50,000 or more tons, simply going full out at about 30 knots or more, that I hadn't realized that the two aircraft I was with were no longer with me. The result was that I got in and dropped my torpedo at about 400 yards, which was very close indeed. They sent all sorts of flak up at us, of course, but fortunately they didn't realize how slow we were, nor did they realize how low we were. Those early torpedoes, you couldn't drop from a height above 60 feet. We were down probably to about 40 feet. And the result was that their anti-aircraft guns couldn't bear on us. They couldn't get them low enough. Although they shot at us with their big guns and made great fountains in the water, which would have been tricky if we'd gone into them. However, I dropped my fish and turned round to get the hell out of it. And my observer had a service camera, and he took a photo of the explosion as the torpedo hit. I don't think she'd seen us. I think that she'd seen the other aircraft, and I think we were a surprise. Or my observer discovered that after we'd turned, the anti-aircraft batteries were no longer firing from amidship, and I think that we'd put them out of action with the explosion. Well, we saw the explosion, or my observer saw the explosion, but we couldn't make certain until we got back on board, when the negative was immediately, of course, developed, and then it clearly showed the explosion.
Anyway, we're right down on the water. I don't know, I suppose 15, 20 feet. And we went in towards the Bismarck, and the Bismarck never saw us. Nothing came at us, and it was most amazing. We went in, we dropped our fish, and turned away, and I saw a spurt of water and assumed that we had got a hit. And then the Bismarck threw everything at us, and we flew through. They were firing their main armament at us, and the huge splashes from the main armament is sufficient to bring an aircraft down. And we flew through the fringe of one of these splashes, and all the fabric in the bottom of the aircraft was ripped off, and we had a pretty cold trip back, but the whole squadron got back.
We got back to the fleet, and entirely due to Captain Bovell in the Victorious, shining his searchlight and making signals which took rather longer than usual, Esmond was able to pick up the lights. Otherwise we could probably have missed her. The weather was very, very unpleasant. It was a dark, raining night, and the wind was very strong. But we all landed on. I think one tail wheel tire burst, and that was about all.
It was pretty rough. Pretty rough. When we got back to the ship, it was quite difficult landing on, because the counter, the stern, was rising and falling 90 feet. And so you had to judge it so that the counter didn't come up and smash you, or you didn't come in under the flight deck and run into the stern.
Even the people that had never done a night landing on a carrier, it was marvellous. The whole aircraft got back. And we got back and had a bacon and eggs and a top, I seem to remember. And then we were expecting to have to go again, but we didn't have to. The Armoured came up from the south, and the Armoured did an attack which damaged the rudder of the Bismarck, which was the beginning and the end, as far as she was concerned.
The following morning, unfortunately, the cruisers, Norfolk, Suffolk, had lost the Bismarck. She had evaded their radar, and we were told, or some of us, to carry out a search from the Victorious. And we went off at, I think about 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock, into this unpleasant weather. And in my case, it was a quite uneventful search, in that we saw nothing apart from breaking seas below and visibility of about, I suppose, a mile, half a mile ahead with the driving mist and rain. When it came time to find the ship on return, unfortunately the Victorious wasn't anywhere to be found. And we did a search, as always trained, called a square search, and also found nothing. The beacon, as I mentioned earlier, didn't bring us any return because we weren't tuned to Victorious's beacon. And it came to watching the petrol in the tank getting less and less. And I was beginning to wonder what the next world was going to be like, because the sea looked very uninviting, when my good friend in the back, Dapper Beddle, tapped me again on the shoulder, and pointing down, I looked over the side, and there, outlined by breaking water, was a ship's, or a lifeboat. But it was obviously full of water. But it didn't take me more than a moment to realize that that was the only thing I was going to be able to survive in. We had been in the air, I suppose, the best part of 5.5 hours then, and that was pretty well over the limits. And so, dropping a smoke float to find the direction and strength of the wind, landed the aircraft in the sea, upwind of what was then, all I could see was breaking water, but realized as it was there was the lifeboat. We got into our rubber dinghy, which we had to manhandle out of the upper wing, and drifted down onto this rather wet-looking boat. Coming alongside it, it was full of water, and the only thing we had to bail with were our flying boots, which we used as scoops, and eventually one person got into the boat, and eventually the three of us, and we were all promptly rather seasick. I think it was possibly due to the strain of the last hour or two.
First, the nearest units attacked the Nazi ship. Then, when she was lost, aircraft searched for her. And finally, when she was found again and disabled by destroyers and aircraft, the battleships came in and finished the job.
The new Victorious herself, one of the aircraft carriers that played a glorious part in the battle. Some of her planes are scarred, but the ship's cat's 9 lives are still intact. The first of Paramount's interviews with heroes of the engagement was accorded by a naval airman, Lieutenant Enniver.
Most of us had done plenty of practice attacks. This was the first chance we'd had of going out and having a crack at the Huns. And we were all very glad that we hit a really good target.
I think perhaps our hit, well, history will tell you anyway, that it made the Bismarck think. And that was her beginning of believing that she was no longer going to get out among the convoys, which is what we were trying to prevent her from doing, but she was on her way back to Brest. It was more or less amidships. But there's been many, and equally, we, the tags, were not debriefed when we got back from the exercise. And I was interviewed recently for the American version of the sinking of the Bismarck, and I was telling the same sort of stories I'm telling you. And he said, well, why is it that the fact that you got a hit is not really mentioned anywhere? I said, because nobody asked me. And they didn't. And had they asked me, I would have said, yes. I was the only one looking aft at that time. If you imagine the aircraft turns round, the pilot's facing that way, the observer was facing that way, and I was the only one looking on. And I saw this spurt, and I thought, well, that's a hit.